Right now, the global economy is bleeding $21.8 trillion a year, simply to pay for violence and the preparation for violence.
Yeah, which is roughly 10.5% of the entire global GDP, just gone. I mean, evaporated right into conflict.
If you break that number down, it is the equivalent of someone effectively pickpocketing about $2,600 from every single person on Earth, every single year. And, instead of getting better, if you look at the structural reality of our world today, the geopolitical landscape is actively fracturing.
It really is. It's systemic disorder on a level we haven't seen in decades. The old rules of global diplomacy are practically being rewritten overnight.
Right, which is exactly what we are going to untangle for you in today's deep dive. We are bypassing the typical daily news churn to look at the massive tectonic plates shifting beneath those global headlines.
Because you really have to understand the underlying anatomy of current geopolitical alliances to make sense of any of it.
Exactly. Our mission today is to unpack exactly how these alliances are fracturing, and we'll see some very surprising cases of this later solidifying. We're also going to look closely at how institutions like the African Union are trying to engineer peace in the middle of all this disorder.
And to do that, we have pulled together a stack of sources curated specifically for this conversation.
Yeah, we are looking at the newly released 2026 Global Peace Index, or the GPI. We're also tracking live geopolitical newswires from Al Jazeera and the Kyiv Independent.
Plus, we're reviewing joint EU and NATO briefing documents, and we're even going through the internal program notes from the African Union's Peace and Security Council for July 2026.
So let's unpack this, because to really understand today's news, everything from drone strikes in the Middle East to broad global tariffs, you have to first understand the era we're actually living in.
Right. And the Global Peace Index has a core thesis that completely changes how you read the morning headlines. They argue we have officially entered the Great Fragmentation.
The Great Fragmentation.
Yes. The GPI identifies this as the third major geopolitical era of the past 50 years. First, you had the bipolar world of the Cold War.
Sure.
Then you had the unipolar post-1990 era of rapid U.S.-led globalization.
Yeah.
And now we are firmly entrenched in this great fragmentation.
I have to push back a little on one of the GPI's main points here, though. They claim that the geopolitical influence of the United States and China is hitting a plateau.
They do, yeah.
But, you look at the news wires, the massive tariffs, the military exercises, the tech bans. It doesn't look like they're losing their grip. It looks like they are tightening it.
Well, it looks like tightening, but statistically, it is a plateau in their ability to expand their spheres of influence. They are still the only two true superpowers, absolutely, but their absolute leverage over the rest of the world has stalled.
So it's kind of like a high school cafeteria. The two most popular kids are still the loudest, but they can't force everyone to sit at their tables anymore. Other groups are setting up their own autonomous tables.
That's a perfect way to look at it. And not only are they setting up their own tables, they're actively trading lunch items with the kids the U.S. and China explicitly told them not to talk to.
Wow, okay.
And we can see exactly who is setting up those new tables when we look at the economic data in our sources. The traditional European great powers are rapidly shrinking in their global economic footprint.
Right, because between 1995 and 2023, Germany's share of global GDP fell by 49%. It nearly halved.
Which is just a staggering drop for Europe's largest economy. It is a massive loss of geopolitical leverage. France dropped by 44%, Italy by 42%, and the UK by 27%.
So the old guard is shrinking.
Exactly.
Wow.
And as that European influence wanes, what we call the middle powers are surging. The number of middle power countries has actually nearly doubled from 9 in 1991 to 16 today.
And we're talking about nations like the United Arab Emirates, Indonesia, Turkey, and Mexico, right?
Correct. And here is the crazy part. The combined material capacity of these 16 middle powers now actually exceeds that of the traditional great powers.
Which completely changes the entire dynamic of that cafeteria. Because how these rising middle powers behave is completely different from the Cold War days. They aren't just picking between the U.S. table or the China table.
No, they aren't. And this is the defining characteristic of the great fragmentation. They are practicing a strategy of accumulation rather than alignment.
Accumulation.
Right. If you take an established middle power from the Cold War era, say Australia or Japan, they were deeply and almost exclusively aligned with U.S. security and economic systems.
But the rising middle powers are playing the field. I mean, accumulation means they take a little from column A, a little from column B.
Saudi Arabia and the UAE are prime examples here. They maintain incredibly strong security ties with the United States, but simultaneously they are procuring Chinese drone and missile technology.
So they are accumulating partnerships to maximize their own strategic autonomy rather than, tying themselves to a single superpower's mast. And when a country like Mexico or Indonesia plays the field like this, it isn't just distant theoretical diplomacy. It fundamentally alters the world you live in.
How so?
Well, when you don't have rigid, predictable alliances, every single global event becomes a chaotic, multi-party negotiation. It's the reason a sudden supply chain bottleneck can spike the cost of electronics or gas in your neighborhood. The predictability of that 1990s globalization boom is just gone.
That's very true.
Yeah.
But that strategy of accumulation hits a massive brick wall when actual bullets start flying. If we look at the escalating U.S.-Iran war right now on the global news wires, it serves as a tragic, real-time microcosm of this fragmentation in action.
Yeah, the tactical reality on the ground is moving incredibly fast. According to Al Jazeera, the U.S. just completed its 13th consecutive night of strikes on Iran.
Right.
And President Donald Trump has stated he is close to deciding on a, quote, massive attack, claiming Iran hasn't received enough payment.
Violations.
And simultaneously, he has imposed broad 10 to 12.5% tariffs on 60 different trading partners.
Which, as you can imagine, triggers an immediate reaction across the board. In retaliation to the military action, Iran's foreign minister invoked Article 51 of the UN Charter, claiming the right to self-defense.
And declaring that any source of aggression against Iran is now a legitimate target.
Right. And here is where we see that wider web of accumulated alliances activate. Because this isn't just a bilateral conflict in a vacuum.
No, far from it. This single conflict acts as a force multiplier for regional fragmentation.
Exactly. Iran is immediately utilizing its recent membership in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is an economic and security bloc founded by China and Russia, to push back politically against what it calls U.S. unilateralism.
While militarily, they are actively expanding the map. The Iranian military claims to have launched new drone strikes on U.S. facilities in Bahrain, specifically the Sheikh Isa Air Base and the Muaffaq Salti Base in Jordan.
And the ripples just keep spreading outward. The Houthis in Yemen have opened a second maritime front, attacking 2 Saudi oil tankers, the Encilia and the Lila in the Red Sea. Yeah, this adds massive pressure to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait at the exact time the Strait of Hormuz is heavily disrupted.
Let's slow down for a second, though, and look at a fascinating nuance from the sources that really exposes how tangled these modern alliances are. I'm talking about Saudi Arabia's pursuit of a Westinghouse AP1000 nuclear reactor.
Oh, yes. This is a perfect example.
This single piece of infrastructure perfectly illustrates the friction of fragmentation.
It really does.
Yeah.
To understand why this reactor is such a geopolitical flashpoint, you have to look at the mechanics of nuclear power. The AP1000 is an advanced pressurized water reactor. It is designed purely for civilian power generation.
Right, so if it's just for generating electricity, why is it causing a massive diplomatic gridlock?
Because of the fuel cycle. Operating a reactor requires enriched uranium, and Israel vehemently opposes the Saudis having their own domestic uranium enrichment pathway.
Even if it's just for civilian use.
Even then. Because having that domestic infrastructure drastically shortens the breakout time, basically. The time it would take to enrich that uranium further to weapons-grade material should the Saudis ever decide to build a bomb. Israel fears this would trigger an unstoppable regional arms race.
But the Saudis are playing hardball here. They are refusing to normalize diplomatic relations with Israel without guarantees of an eventual Palestinian state.
While the U.S. is completely stuck in the middle, they desperately want to secure this commercial nuclear deal with Saudi Arabia, partly to keep them from buying a reactor from China or Russia instead.
Which ties right back to that accumulation strategy we talked about.
Exactly. It exposes the sheer tension between commercial interests, non-proliferation concerns, and Middle East diplomacy. In this era of fragmentation, no bilateral deal is truly bilateral anymore. Everything is subject to the vetoes, fears, and demands of 3 or 4 other middle powers.
And the economic toll of all this friction is hitting the global markets hard. The newswires note Brent crude oil surging past $100 a barrel due to these maritime blockades and tanker strikes.
And to put a number on it, the GPI estimates that finding a resolution to just the Iran conflict alone could save the global economy over $2 trillion.
$2 trillion. Which brings us right back to that staggering $21.8 trillion figure we started with. The sheer volume of resources consumed by navigating this fragmented, violent landscape is literally reshaping the global economy.
It is.
So in the Middle East, we see fragmentation causing incredibly volatile chaos. But when you look at Europe, their answer to this fracturing world seems to be building a fortress.
That's a great way to phrase it.
Right. I mean, while everyone else is playing the field, Europe is aggressively gluing itself together.
It is a really striking contrast in alliance strategies. The joint EU and NATO actions regarding Ukraine show a level of deep structural integration that goes far beyond just sending financial aid.
Yeah, the European Commission just adopted a massive 90 billion euro support loan for Ukraine for 2026 to 2027, which breaks down to 60 billion for military assistance and 30 billion for the budget.
Right.
But I have to ask you, is this deep integration a sign of strength, or is it a panic response? Like a survival mechanism for a bloc that, as we established earlier, is hemorrhaging its share of global GDP?
It is almost certainly a survival mechanism. If you pay close attention to the language the EU is using in these briefings, they aren't just talking about charity or defense anymore. They're talking about integrating Ukraine into Europe's defense industrial base.
Ah, right. Like the 1 billion euro EU-Ukraine drone deal that was dispersed during European Commission. President Ursula von der Leyen's 11th visit to Kyiv. The Commission stated explicitly that this is a two-way street.
Exactly. Meaning Europe isn't just handing over €1 billion. They are buying access. They're securing their own technological edge by integrating battle-tested Ukrainian innovations in drone and counter-drone warfare into their own militaries.
Wow, so they're using the conflict to rapidly accelerate their own defense capabilities in a dangerous world.
Yes, and they're trying to export that consolidated influence outward, too. The EU is actively backing ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and China to reach a legally binding code of conduct in the South China Sea by the end of the year.
We also saw EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas in Manila upgrading ties with the Philippines, who are the current ASEAN chair, to an enhanced partnership. She explicitly stated that maritime disputes must be settled through dialogue, not coercion.
Which is a very direct pushback against aggressive tactics in international waters.
They are definitely trying to aggressively export their rule-based order. But internally, the GPI points out a startling detail about the cost of this fortress mentality. Belgium saw a massive 10.9% deterioration in its peacefulness score.
Yeah, and when you think of a drop in peacefulness, Belgium isn't usually the first country that comes to mind, right?
Definitely not. But in the context of the index, this drop was driven entirely by heavy militarization. Belgium suddenly hiked its defense spending to nearly 2% of its GDP to meet NATO targets, massively increasing its weapons imports.
So yes, Europe is integrating, but it is an integration built on a foundation of rapid continent-wide rearmament.
So Europe's answer to fragmentation is to build a well-armed fortress. They are buying weapons and hardening borders. But is militarization the only way to survive this era? Because if we look at the internal program notes from the African Union's Peace and Security Council for July 2026, they are testing a completely opposite hypothesis.
They are. The African Union is attempting to engineer peace through a highly structured institutional approach, rather than relying solely on military deterrence.
Right. The agenda under Uganda's chairmanship reveals a deeply proactive strategy.
Yes. The standout concept in these sources is the proposed AU model on trigger mechanism for early warning and early action.
I look at this like having a smoke detector connected directly to the sprinkle system.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
Because historically, the international community is actually quite good at early warning. We often know exactly when a conflict is brewing.
The warning signs are always there.
Always. The fatal flaw is in the early action. We hear the alarm, but the political hesitation means nobody turns on the hose until the building is already engulfed.
How does a trigger mechanism actually solve that? I mean, how does the AU legally bypass a sovereign nation's right to handle its own internal affairs if the alarm goes off?
Well, that is the exact tension this mechanism is designed to resolve. The goal is to establish specific, agreed-upon indicators beforehand. So say, a completely collapsed electoral process or a military mutiny.
Okay.
Once that threshold is crossed, and it becomes clear the national processes are failing or unable to address the crisis, it automatically triggers action from the Peace and Security Council. It attempts to bypass the usual political paralysis by making the intervention a systemic response rather than a political debate.
Taking the politics out of the initial response, that's fascinating. And they are also tackling the root causes of these conflicts directly. The July agenda highlights the Accra Third Forum, which is entirely focused on youth inclusion to stop the wave of unconstitutional changes of government.
Basically, military coups.
Right. And this is vital because the AU acknowledges that their previous declarations simply haven't stopped the recent trend of military takeovers. In 2025 alone, there were 2 successful coups and 1 attempted coup on the continent.
Jeez.
The established norm that prevents coup makers from participating in subsequent elections has, in practice, been completely abandoned. So the AU is pivoting to address the underlying demographic pressures engaging the youth to stabilize the political landscape from the ground up.
And the second major initiative is a ministerial session on de-radicalization. This represents a massive shift. They are moving away from relying solely on military force to fight terrorism, and instead building a framework for dialogue, negotiation, and rehabilitation for members of terrorist groups.
It is a stark acknowledgement that you cannot simply shoot your way out of an ideological insurgency. Now, if we look at the reality on the ground using the GPI data, the results of these institutional efforts are definitely mixed.
Sub-Saharan Africa remains the 3rd least peaceful region globally. Right. The data shows Chad experienced a severe 6.4% deterioration, entirely driven by the ongoing conflict and terrorism in the Central Sahel corridor.
But there are striking success stories in the data that prove the AU's institutional theory can work. Like, Mauritius remains highly peaceful, ranking 18th globally, specifically because of its strong institutional stability and mature democratic system. It recorded improvements across all 3 domains measured by the index.
And look at Gabon. Gabon saw massive improvements, a 5.9% jump across all domains following its post-coup elections, and transitioned to President Nguema in May 2025.
It really shows that stabilization and recovery are entirely possible even after a major political rupture, if the transition is managed well.
Exactly. Conversely, you see what happens when those democratic institutions fail. Tanzania faced a severe 7.3% deterioration, its largest single-year drop ever, due to deadly crackdowns by security forces following its disputed October 2025 elections. It perfectly illustrates why the African Union is so intensely focused on engineering resilient political frameworks. When the institutions hold, peace holds. When they break, the descent is rapid.
So let's synthesize the journey we've been on today. You've seen how the great fragmentation is driving middle powers to play the field, accumulating partnerships rather than picking sides in a new Cold War.
We've explored how the Middle East serves as the ultimate geopolitical friction point, where a single nuclear reactor or drone strike can send economic shockwaves around the globe.
We've looked at how Europe is circling the wagons through massive financial and industrial defense integration, and how the African Union is striving to build systemic trigger mechanisms to catch conflicts before they explode.
It is a world desperately trying to organize itself amidst unprecedented stress. But I want to leave you with one final chilling detail from the Global Peace Index that fundamentally threatens all of the diplomacy, the treaties, and the human alliances we just spent this entire time discussing.
The ultimate wild card.
Yes, the integration of artificial intelligence in warfare. The GPI points out that during recent conflicts, the use of AI in algorithmic targeting compressed the human review of lethal strikes to roughly 20 seconds per target.
20 seconds.
We are talking about automated systems flagging tens of thousands of suspected targets, despite a known, acknowledged 10% error rate.
20 seconds of human oversight to end a life, based on a machine's recommendation.
The defining peace and conflict question of our era is no longer whether AI will reshape global security, but at what speed it will completely remove human beings from the decision loop entirely.
We've just spent this deep dive exploring how human alliances, careful treaties, and institutional trigger mechanisms are trying to hold a fragmenting world together. But what happens to global politics when the decision to take a human life is handed over to a machine operating faster than any diplomat can speak? That is something to think about until our next deep dive.